This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We are very lucky today to have a very special guest who was recently on the Netflix documentary, Churchill at War. We have the great Dr. Warren Dockter. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, my pleasure. For those of you not familiar with Warren, he's the CEO and president of the East Tennessee Historical Society. He's also a Churchill scholar. He has a few books on Churchill, including Churchill in the Islamic World, which you can find on Amazon, along with some other books on Churchill, and we're thrilled to have him on. You can also follow Warren on Twitter if you'd like, or X, Warren Dockter. How did you get into Churchill, Warren?
Well, it's maybe unusual that the president of the East Tennessee Historical Society is a Churchill scholar, and I appreciate that. So I graduated from the University of Tennessee, and then I went and did my graduate work at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And then that sort of led on to other things. I was a research fellow at Cambridge, at Clare Hall. I was a bi-fellow at Churchill College. My book, Churchill and the Islamic World, came out of my research for my PhD. And then I was a professor or lecturer of international politics at Aberystwyth University. So this has sort of always been my field, and I had worked professionally in the UK for a long time and focused on the British Empire. And then I transitioned to work in nonprofits back where I'm from. And it still allows me to deal with a kind of British colonial space because, of course, East Tennessee at one point in the 18th century was a part of the British Empire. We have just down the road, there's a place called Fort Loudon that was originally constructed in 1756. As a part of the kind of British expansion around the Appalachians. So it seems like they're not connected, but they're kind of connected.
Okay. Well, what we're going to talk about today for the episode, we're going to discuss Napoleon's influences on two 20th century leaders, Hitler and Churchill. And I like to start with Hitler because that's the comparison that Napoleon gets the most for whatever reason. And some say the similarities are there on Hitler and Napoleon. Both men took over their countries at weak moments. Both conquered much of Europe. Both invaded Russia, and their armies suffered terribly. And both men were also defeated by the defenders of common freedom. On the comparison to Hitler to Napoleon, the great author David Chandler states, the comparison is odious. Nothing could be more flattering to Hitler and more degrading to Napoleon. What is your opinion on the comparison?
I come from the school of thought that that's a loathsome comparison. Churchill himself thought that it was a bad comparison and even said that on the House of Commons, that people had been making this comparison that Hitler was the sort of Napoleon of the 20th century, and that he thought it was ludicrous to compare, and I've forgotten the exact wording, but it's something like compare the great man Napoleon to a butcher of the Caucasus like Hitler. I tend to agree with that. What I find interesting is there are historians. One of them was a previous archives director at Churchill College named Corelli Barnett, who's a famous kind of Napoleonic historian and wrote a book about Napoleon. Now, he doesn't directly compare him to Hitler in that way, but does kind of frame him as a kind of mafia boss and an opportunist. So there is something to be said, I think, for the fact that maybe both Adolf Hitler and Napoleon Bonaparte had an ability to read situations and understand the opportunism in the decisions that they were making on a sort of like grand level. But I think that's kind of where the similarities stop. And if you need any kind of proof in that, I think you can look at the ideologies that they're spreading. I mean, Napoleon is essentially wiping away the old feudalistic regime, the ancient regime, as we say, and installing ideas from the Enlightenment, the Napoleonic Code and so forth. So, I mean, there's lots of, which contain, as even Churchill said, the kind of seeds of liberty in this kind of new order he's trying to build. Mm-hmm. Whereas Hitler is utterly just taking and controlling and destroying and taking land for land's sake. And then the obvious consequence of that is the Holocaust, which, of course, Napoleon would have never even conceptualized.
Right. He actually did the opposite. He, got rid of the ghettos and freed a lot of Jews from oppression. Yeah.
Exactly. So to me, when you get down to the core of it, they're completely different figures that happen to have a similar trajectory, but that's sort of where it ends.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say both men were looters of conquered territories, but yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think there's more differences than similarities. And the legacies, too, as you mentioned, kind of Napoleon brought the Napoleonic Code. He abolished feudalism in much of Europe. He encouraged promotion by merit in both the army and the government, built the National Bank of France as well as the education systems. He's also still revered in France and some parts of Europe. And Hitler brought nothing but destruction. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to look at anything Hitler did and say, oh, well, that's got a positive legacy in it, because it's so tainted by the obvious absolute evil, right? I mean, that'd be like looking at Mordor and being like, well, Sauron built some cool towers. Well, yeah, but that doesn't matter really. And so, you occasionally you'll hear these people talk about the Autobahn or whatever, and it's just like, I think you're missing the mark. If you're into that kind of territory, the Nazi regime is a bad regime, and their vision was bad and like openly bad. Whereas Napoleon, I think, was confronted with a different situation, which was, look, you have a clearly corrupt and broken system, and we need something better. And I think that if you look at Napoleon's trajectory, you can see that he starts out very clearly as someone who's trying to wipe away the old regime and put in a kind of new merit-based system in place. Now, at some point, he starts making decisions that aren't necessarily congruent with that, particularly maybe after he crowns himself emperor. I mean, his own ego becomes a part of the project, right? And at that point, he veers off a kind of like good guy narrative, but that's not to say that he still didn't have at the core the ideals that he was trying to spread and leave a positive legacy.
Yeah, and I read that a lot of these conquered lands, like they like the idea of liberty and equality in front of the law, but they didn't like the packaging the president came in because it was under bayonet point. Like, hey, accept these new ideas, but you have to do it according to our rules.
Right. Well, it kind of reminds me of the Zach De La Rocca critique of America in the post-war era, right? Not to quote Rage Against the Machine at you, but it's like, buy our products or get laid to waste. I mean, it's like, we want to do business with you. You're going to do business with us.
Right.
And so I do think, again, it's the packaging. It's like, hey, you need to adopt these codes or there's going to be a problem. And then, obviously he introduces his own layer of corruption. He's installing his brothers as kings. And like there are issues. He's not totally altruistic, as anyone who would be in that position wouldn't be, right?
Right. And there was oppression. I mean, certainly in Spain and Portugal, there was heavy oppression and atrocities taken out against the population. Yeah, there's some definitely reprehensible things that Napoleon did, but I don't –
But the difference, I guess I'm saying, is that Hitler's position was, I want to do atrocious things for the greater good of like my cronies and me, as well as like a sort of abstract notion of a greater Germany. And like, we're going to do not just bad stuff, but like incomprehensibly bad stuff.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Whereas Napoleon's like, I want to achieve these ends by installing kind of these ideals, and the other things kind of happen as a collateral as a result of trying to do this. Now, I'm not a Napoleon apologist by any means. There was a lot of mismanagement, a lot of atrocious things happened under his rule, and again, particularly in Portugal and Spain.
Yeah, I agree. It's a whole different thing. It is interesting, though, how much Hitler and his generals studied Napoleon, and I'll just give you one comparison here. Napoleon's foreign minister to Russia, Caulaincourt, wrote a memoir called With Napoleon in Russia, and it was read with great interest by many German officers during their invasion of Russia. German generals made reference to it while describing the character of the Russian soldier, their stubbornness in defense, and their capacity to endure bombardments. And General von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, reportedly referred to the work often. General Blumentritt recounted, quote, I can still see von Kluge trudging through the mud from his sleeping quarters to his office, and standing there before the map with Caulaincourt's book in his hand. And that went on day after day, end quote. So it wasn't just that Napoleon influenced Hitler and Churchill. His military accomplishments were kind of studied, weren't they?
There's no question. I mean, I think that you can see that not just on the German side, but of course on the British side in terms of, there's maybe an over-reliance on the Navy, right? Because there's that's kind of the historic ideal that certainly exists in British naval thinking is that, hey, we're the reason that Napoleon lost. And so, you have to think about, I think, how the generals understood. One of the things I think that really mattered here, and if you ask German Wehrmacht generals if they paid attention to this, they would say yes, but they didn't. If you look at the German structure, which is Napoleon's use of presses, propaganda, I'm going to say intelligence to some degree. The German generals of Wehrmacht military intelligence, the Abwehr, was not a very good intelligence operation. Now, part of that is because they were kind of intentionally not good because most of them were not Nazis. So they were kind of like, we're ready for a change. Right. And, there's the whole British double cross system. But Napoleon was a master of doing things like, if the opponent's generals were not very good, he talked about how they were great so that would get back. So they would promote the kind of stupid, he played the press well. Right. And that's something I think we can also say, not necessarily Adolf Hitler, but that the power structure under him weaponized was press and propaganda. I think that there may be a correlation there, particularly during wartime.
Did Hitler believe himself to be a tactical genius like Napoleon? I know this is ludicrous even just saying it because, Napoleon was at the front leading his troops, but Hitler at the beginning did have some huge victories, obviously over France and Poland. Did he think he was a military genius in his mind?
I don't know enough about Hitler's mindset to think that. I do think, and this kind of goes back to Cornelius Burnett's argument about Napoleon, he's an opportunist. And I honestly don't think, at least at the beginning, Hitler thought that anything would work. And it just kept working. And he kind of got to the point where it was like, I don't understand why this is happening. He didn't mastermind the Blitzkrieg. And you can see how the Blitzkrieg works. Overwhelming pressure at one point, break the line, split. That's kind of what you want to achieve. They had invested in these tanks. There was such a kind of fear of war. And all of this comes down to understanding the opportunity, which I think Hitler had a talent for. As far as him being a tactical genius, I don't think that's really the case. But I think at some point he began to believe that he was because he kept winning.
Right.
And so, but then, you see what would be tactical, catastrophic decisions like not pushing the advantage at Dunkirk. There are lots of mistakes, and that can also be said of Napoleon, but certainly more of Hitler, and certainly in much larger ways. It's important here to also mention Churchill and Napoleon as tactical thinkers, because Churchill liked to imagine himself as a kind of tactical, brilliant person. But of course he wasn't. A great example of this is the Dardanelles. Churchill has this idea that you can break the Dardanelle lines with the ships alone using the Navy, which is again an over-reliance on the Navy. Ultimately that fails. They have to land the Anzac troops. That goes terribly at Gallipoli for Britain and gives the Ottoman Empire one of its largest victories in the First World War. And one of the things I think is interesting is that, Napoleon is so good for so long, because he's able to, he is a tactical gem. There's no way around that, right? Like he could see, he's playing like 3D chess.
Yeah.
And Churchill liked to think that he could play 3D chess, and I don't think he was there. And the Dardanelles is a good example. And his insistence that the soft underbelly of Europe is the thing that's going to break the Germans in the First World War and the Second World War. So we see it fail at the Dardanelles, but then the invasion of Italy, you invade Italy, okay, that goes well. We knock the Italians out, not that they were too much of a threat, and then it's like you have to continually go up over the Alps. So suddenly all the German divisions on the Alps are like, well, this is easy because people are, and the fact that Churchill kept insisting on this, and that he was kind of a vocal opponent to D-Day, when Eisenhower was like, well, this is the plan now. And Churchill, because of his experiences at the Dardanelles, was like, well, no, this isn't going to work. It didn't work for me. So I think that Churchill, there's a famous moment, right? Someone, I want to say it was R.F. Murrow, maybe said that Churchill famously gave the British line its roar. And Churchill heard this and said, well, I'd like to also think that I gave it some of its teeth, because he wasn't happy just being the orator or the statesman. He wanted to be this military kind of genius, and you can see this as a child. He plays with toys. I mean, he was in the military, same as Napoleon was. He was in the cavalry unit, saw action, was a soldier until he was a journalist. And so kind of was both. But I do think that, Napoleon, in terms of tactical genius, Napoleon comes out way ahead of the other two. I think Churchill comes out way ahead of Hitler. I just think Hitler got really lucky.
Yeah, and he had a really good army underneath him.
Exactly. And so a lot of this is about the brilliance of the German ability to wage war and the officers that were in place. But, the longer Hitler's there, the more he replaces the old structures with his new cronies who aren't so tactically brilliant, right?
Right. And he starts overruling these generals who know better, but he just,
right.
Yeah, bad decision after bad decision. Okay. Let's get now to the comparisons of Napoleon and Churchill, which are less clear, but both men were great readers of books. Both men were excellent examples of leadership during war. What other similarities do you think they had?
So there's a great essay, maybe you've read it online, that Alan Packwood, who's a good friend of mine, wrote, that sort of talks about the comparisons of Napoleon and Churchill. And let's just start with their personalities. Napoleon, I mean, if you read some of the stuff Napoleon says about how, nobody in Europe was ready to do this, so we need to give everybody an example of what it means to be great or to be a great man. I've forgotten the exact quotes. But, he was an enormous egotist. And so many times, as we've seen, the 100-day span when he comes back from Elba and is like, all right, let's do this, his own ego gets in the way. Whereas as Churchill was also a huge egoist. There's a famous quote about how, he tells Violet Asquith that we're all worms, but he's a glowworm, and he believes Providence is with, there's all this. He also believes that he is a great man. I don't think that Churchill's ego got in his way in the same way that Napoleon's ego becomes liability. Churchill's ego was a liability at moments. I think one of those is probably, the Italian campaign in the Second World War. Not so much the Dardanelles, because Churchill had an ongoing relationship with leaders of the Ottoman Empire. There was a split between the kind of pro-British and the pro-Turkish, and Churchill more or less had intelligence that indicated if British gunboats showed up on the Bosphorus, that would give the internal power struggle enough oomph to get rid of Enver Pasha, who was the kind of pro-German guy. And so I think there is a kind of a logic to what he was doing there, not just, hey, look how great I am, I can do this thing. So I do think the men, understanding the man behind it, but they are both great readers. Churchill's more of a writer than Napoleon, but they're both men of ideas. I think they're enchanted by kind of ideas, and you can see that in what they do. But one of the important things, this kind of gets back to the tactics, I guess, is that if you look at their strategies at the end, and this is more about the differences than the similarities, and this is the point that Alan makes in his essay, which I agree with. Churchill, after the Dardanelles, there's a lesson here about how you defeat an enemy. And if you ask Churchill how he was able to win the Second World War, we talked about the Russian invasion. He understands that Russia paid the blood price for knocking out Hitler and the Nazi machine. And so, he builds a coalition. He spends a lot of time frustrated trying to deal with the Nazis in North Africa. He understood eventually, and if you read his memoirs, you can see this because it's called Closing the Ring, is I think the name of the third or fourth book. There are 6 books. He understood the only way to defeat an enemy like that is to get them when they're weakened through a coalition. This is an example of when Churchill's not being an egotist. Right, but Napoleon in his last 100 days thinks, I can do this by myself. I will break the coalition. I can do this. It doesn't matter that they're all stronger than me. I'm Napoleon. I can do this. The point is that, that lesson, that's the lesson. Churchill understood, took a coalition. Churchill understood you had to weaken your enemy. It's not a one and done. This takes time. It's a process. Be patient. Napoleon never learned that lesson. And that's the lesson I think that Churchill, having read all about Napoleon, wanting to write his own book about Napoleon, learned from Napoleon.
I think that's a really good point. Churchill learned to be a partner in a coalition. Yeah. When Napoleon took over a country, it was more like a vassal state. Like, yeah, all right, you still have your country, but you have to do what I say. There was no partnership.
That's absolutely right. And if you look at the relationship that Churchill had, not just with FDR or Eisenhower, but also Stalin, or the guys in Greece, there's a clear thing that Churchill's like, I want to be a partner to you. Let's work together. There is no universe in which Napoleon would ever want to be a partner with anyone. He's in there to come do business his way, and that's it.
Yeah. I've read that Churchill kept a bust of Napoleon on his desk and bought several of his biographies and considered him one of the most able men in history. He said, quote, the greatest man of action ever known to human records, end quote. Why do you think he was inspired by Napoleon? Like, why didn't he have a bust of the Duke of Wellington on his desk?
That's a great question. And you would think that he would have Wellington on his desk. This is one of the real interesting things about how people feed on things. So one of the things we know Napoleon also was kind of interested in, read loads about, was John Marlborough and his victory at Blenheim. And he utilized, he learned from those tactics. Of course, Churchill, while he had a bust of Napoleon, he had a portrait of John Marlborough on his wall. The Duke of Marlborough. And I think that there's something in that they sort of, how stuff learns. But Churchill, one of the things I think you got to remember is that of all the countries Churchill visited, he visited France the most. He went to France continually from his youth all the way through when he was an old man. That's where he liked to go and repose. That's where he painted. If you've ever seen Churchill's paintings, it's always of the French Riviera. Churchill loved France. He spoke French. We even have some of the speeches that he's given in France. His vision in the post-war era for the United States of Europe starts with France being at the center. So there is a kind of a Francophile element to Churchill that I think is often overlooked. And so I think Churchill respected Napoleon as a Francophile would, but also because he saw him ultimately as this man of action. And I was going to mention the quote that you mentioned about him being the ablest man. He later changed that in his History of the English-speaking people and said he was the greatest man of action since Julius Caesar because he had to walk it back a little bit. But there's a better quote, and Allen uses this in his. Napoleon may have been a military tyrant, a conqueror, a man of order and discipline, a man of mundane ambitions, overwhelming egotism. But his grandeur defied misfortune and rises superior even to time. It takes something for Winston Churchill to say you're superior to time. And if you read a lot of what Churchill writes about Napoleon, certainly the things he was reading, it's hagiographic, right? It's very pro-Napoleon. You don't really get a kind of anti-Napoleon thing, in the sort of broader grand context till kind of later on. I mean, Corelli Barnett's one of the leading voices that talks about Napoleon being an opportunist in terms of serious history. But Churchill always had this kind of grand vision. And even in his history of the English-speaking people, the volume he talks about Napoleon, I think it's volume 3, there's a chapter, and it's just called Napoleon. And for a moment, a Frenchman becomes the protagonist of a book series about the English-speaking people, which I think is remarkable. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Churchill absolutely adored Napoleon. But the important thing is to go back to the fact that Churchill was not uncritical of him. As Allen said, that's the main lesson he can take away, is that he saw Napoleon's ego was a problem and that he needed to learn to be a good partner. And Napoleon never learned that lesson.
And I think circling back to how I opened, why didn't he have the Duke of Wellington who defeated Napoleon on his desk? I think Napoleon's last victory was that of posterity. He got to go to St. Helena and write his memoirs. And yeah, Wellington beat him. But if you put a picture of Napoleon on a wall and Wellington on a wall and ask anyone, which one of the two can you identify? It's because he's Napoleon. He won the war of posterity.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I mean, we're still talking about Napoleon's legacy 200 years after the fact. We talk about Wellington's legacy because he defeated Napoleon. I mean, that's the reality, is he's a part of the story because he's able to stop a kind of historical force. Yeah,
like we don't talk about his prime minister roles very often.
No, and that's what I mean. I think is quite interesting. So, and a lot of this has to do with, I mean, if we zoom out for a second, we talk about the march of time. There's a moment in European history when the old regimes are gone, particularly after the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and reconfiguring what Europe would look like and how that would work. I mean, that's why Napoleon's posterity, his legacy, lives, is because of the Napoleonic Code and the meritocracy and the fact that the old feudal or quasi-feudal way of doing things couldn't work anymore.
And I think you just hit upon something which leads me to my next question. I've seen that tech CEOs have been reading biographies of Napoleon, And I was going to ask you, what lessons can government leaders and CEOs learn from Napoleon? But maybe that's it. Like, old ways don't have to be the new ways. Like, you can always develop a better system.
I think that's one of the, and that's also why I think you see it occurring in tech, because a lot of CEOs read Napoleon and have done. But I think the idea of the tech world saying, hey, we have to think about wiping away, the old way of doing things is gone. We're going to try to build a new future. The fun corporate way to say that is future casting now, which I hate. But that's what we're all trying to do, because and now particularly we're at one of those moments. We're at a technological jump in the age of information with AI. If you think about where we're at a moment where we have to come up with a new order. Now, Napoleon understood that new order is going to be a little sloppy to begin with. There's going to be mistakes that are going to be made. It isn't going to be perfect. There's going to be problems. And I think you look at people like Elon Musk as a kind of technological Napoleon, and mistakes are being made. You can look at Twitter itself as an example of a mistake that Elon Musk has made. But also look at the things that he's done. Now, he's not necessarily out there working out the math himself, but he's enabled people to figure out how to catch rockets. Bro, that's like, we're in the future. I mean, and we're actively talking about colonizing Mars. And for all the faults of Elon Musk, the guy has empowered a kind of mind culture about, we have a problem, let's fix that problem, which is exactly what Napoleon did. This system won't work, we have to fix it.
Right. They always talk about, in the tech world, becoming a disruptor of, like Uber, disrupting the taxi service, or Airbnb disrupting the hotel industry. Like, finding that tech new ground, like it's AI or quantum computing, whatever it is that disrupts the old way of doing it.
Well, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, this is going to sound nuts and also a weird place to bring this up, but like, I'm interested in cryptocurrency. And so you can see with things like Bitcoin, I'm sort of heavily involved with a thing called AMP token, which is about replacing debt payment rails for retailers. And I think that, they're trying to do something completely new. And you listen to the people who were founders, this is a Napoleonic moment by coming up with a new way. And sometimes that's messy, right? I mean, that's the thing. But it takes I'm going to say, man of action, to use Churchill's words, to see these things through.
Getting back to the comparison between the three men, all were able to galvanize their countries toward a goal, not always a positive goal, but towards a goal.
Sure.
And all three were excellent orators. What qualities do you think all three had in common?
I think all three men were excellent in their way of becoming a kind of, through propaganda, through lots of different ways. I mean, and I'll talk about each one's kind of ability to do that in a second, but to allow themselves to become a personification of the state that they imagine, that they want. So in the instance of Napoleon was able to use press, like we talked about earlier, and representations of himself in the press as a kind of what the new France would be. Mm-hmm. That this is logical, it's ordered, and it's sort of unstoppable, but in a good way, right? If you look at what Churchill did, I mean, one of the things that he was able to kind of weaponize in the press, and I mean this politically, not in a literal sense, is caricature. And Napoleon did this as well. That's why Churchill always had the cigar. He knew how the cartoonist would cartoon him. So he was able to kind of use that to his advantage. And so that pugnacious face and thing, that's why you have the English bulldog, and so the same with the kind of French, military might that Napoleon was projecting. Churchill's doing that pugnacious, like, do what you want, you're going to have to deal with me kind of look. And I think of the three of them, they were all good at this. And obviously Hitler was able to kind of weaponize the press in a literal sense. But also the way he was able to use his oratory to do this. And, Churchill had an amazing oratory. And we don't really know what Napoleon sounded like, obviously. But if you listen, there's a famous quote, and I believe it was A.J.P. Taylor's historian I really respected. And he talked about, as a kid, the difference between these men, because he was a child during the Second World War. And he said they would broadcast Hitler's speeches, and, he's ranting. And you'd listen, and he didn't speak German at the time. And he thought, God, this guy, the way he spoke, made you believe that he was capable of anything. And it was terrifying. But that when Churchill spoke and broadcasted the speeches that he would have said in Parliament, on the radio, or just on the radio addressing the nation, that he made you feel like you could achieve anything, that you could do And that's the kind of difference in the oratory between them. And one of the things I think that also is remarkable about their oratory, the way they use their oratory, Hitler was always like, this is happening, we're taking this over, it's going great, even when it wasn't going great.
Yeah.
And and Churchill starts from a position of, guys, it's not looking great for us. France is gone. That the famous we will fight them in the beach starts with what General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over.
Yeah.
And Churchill wants to go back in and help France, but it's like, guys, this is bleak. We got, and so one of the things I think that's kind of brilliant, without giving away secrets, Churchill was able to go in and say, guys, the threat we're facing is real. And he didn't hide that from the British public. He brought them on the journey with him through his oratory. And that's kind of an amazing power.
Yeah, and then you flip it over like 44, 45 when bombs are raining on Berlin every day and Goebbels is saying everything's fine.
Yeah, we got that tank thing. Like we got the tiger's teeth, what it's called, the dragon's teeth. It's fine.
Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously the incongruence and people, because people then sort of see the man behind the curtain.
Right.
And Hitler, that kind of blows the whole thing. Now, and we don't know how Napoleon would have spoken in that way, but we have his talks and his codes. And we can imagine just in the way he was able to utilize the press that he would also have galvanized, particularly the French military, to his will in a pretty impressive way.
Well, let's talk about the downfall of each man to kind of wrap up. Obviously, we know Hitler is surrounded by all sides, and he ends up hiding in a bunker before killing himself. Napoleon's imprisoned on an island in the middle of nowhere, and Churchill's removed from office right after he led through Great Britain through its darkest moment. How does each popular leader fade away? It seems to happen very quickly.
Vitamin Water was born in New York because New Yorkers wanted more. Like more flavor to go with all the flavor. A refreshing drink after climbing 6 flights of stairs to a walk-up apartment or standing in the subway station in 100-degree heat. Focus when I have an 8-hour shift. And Triple X after I was out all night at a club. Call Triple X. Drink vitamin water. It's from New York.
That's your money saying it's time for a McDonald's run. Because with new McValue at McDonald's, you get more than you expect. Like buy a 6-piece McNuggets and add a McChicken for just $1. Your money says let's go. Get more than you expect with new McValue. Prices and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
I don't know. I think that's a really great point. I mean, obviously, of the three, Hitler's defeat is very ignominious. I mean, he kills himself, and the whole world sort of descends on Berlin. I mean, and that's the end of the show. With Napoleon, I mean, he had to go to St. Helena. It was like Europe couldn't figure out what to do with him if he was alive. Right. So it's just like put him off the board, right? So he goes down to St. Helena, and then I think there's like, hey, we've got to rebuild the world after Napoleon. What does that look like? And of course, this opens up all kinds of stuff in Germany that eventually Bismarck steps into. But it's also a kind of like, again, it is a kind of quietening. Now, of course, Napoleon's legacy starts coming back in spades, particularly as you see the power of Germany and Bismarck's Germany grow, or Prussia initially, but then Germany. Right. Churchill's defeat is kind of interesting because, or his political defeat, because one, a lot of people are like, how could this happen? And the first is Churchill spent 15 years telling people that he's not like other conservatives, that he gets what's going on here, that the Nazis are bad. Whereas most conservatives like Halifax and Chamberlain are like, oh, hey, let's make a peace with them and we'll focus on Russia. And so Churchill is sort of separated himself from the Conservative Party. And of course, because of the peculiarities of the British electoral system, you vote your party, not your man. And so if you look at the campaign slogan for Labour in that election was cheer for Churchill, vote for Labour. And so that's one of the reasons Churchill was kind of pushed aside. The other is that he gave this sort of catastrophic speech saying that the Labour Party would be like the sort of Communist Party, would have its own kind of secret police. It's Gestapo. It's called the Gestapo speech. This, even his own wife wrote to him, Clementine, was like, that was over the line. That was ridiculous. And, who knows if he was just taken away. But as a result, of course, Clement Attlee steps in and then becomes prime minister, and it turns over to Labour. And I wonder if there's also a way to examine this, that this may actually be a kind of Elba moment for Churchill, because Churchill, of course, is still on the scene. And even in opposition is doing quite phenomenal stuff. So, he goes to Fulton, Missouri. He gives the Iron Curtain speech, which basically outlines global geopolitics for the next 50 years, or at least until the fall of the Soviet Union. And then in the same year, he gives the United States of Europe speech, which outlines the European Union, more or less, right? The United States of Europe, which was in September of that year. So he's still on the scene operating as a political force. He's just not focused on interior British politics.
I think that's a great comparison. I never really thought about it, like have an Elba moment, because Napoleon, his first exile, he was still in Europe. He was just emperor of this tiny island called Elba. And he was rebuilding the island, trying to build its economy up. But he was also, like you said, kind of have an ear to the ground on what's going on in Europe, like Churchill was, still involved somewhat.
Exactly. And so then Napoleon, of course, comes back, and there's the 100 Days to Waterloo.
Yep.
Well, Churchill comes back in 51 and has a 5-year premiership. And in that 5 years, a lot of people overlook his that premiership because not a whole lot of stuff's happening. But actually, I would argue some pretty important stuff is happening. One is NATO is sort of being reconfigured. But one of the most important things that I think is, again, overlooked is in 1953. Now, Churchill has a stroke, and so from 53 to 55 is kind of rough. But when the hydrogen bomb is detonated, Churchill talks about kind of the empire withdrawing from the Suez, and this sort of leads on to the Suez Crisis later. But he makes the point, with this kind of technology, there's no real reason to hold the Suez. The idea of the British Empire in the traditional way we've been talking about since 1840, it doesn't make sense now. This is a new order. And so, the other thing that Churchill was able to help garner in those years is the decline and help manage at least the beginning of the shrinking ending of the British Empire. Of course, the Suez Crisis kind of forces that to happen. But also maintaining a strong forge of alliance with America during the Cold War in a way that Anthony Eden never really wanted or wasn't particularly interested in. But Churchill was able to help garner that relationship even when Britain wasn't at the power seat anymore.
Right.
And he's able to maintain these things to eventually lead to a detente in 59 between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. And Churchill lays that groundwork in that 5 years when he's there. So I think it's often overlooked, but I think actually there's a lot of stuff that happens in the 51 to 55 government where Churchill's still kind of on the scene trying to do things internationally, which I think are kind of important.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm sure that was a difficult time. A lot of hardliners in Britain didn't want the empire to end, but it was, like you said, it was past the time where it needed to be scaled back a little bit.
And one of the interesting things you can also draw here is that Churchill, when he came on initially, when he ran and won in 51, he was like, well, look, I'm only going to be here a year. It's a caretaker government. I'm going to hand over to Anthony Eden. That's going to be it. And of course, he stayed till 55, which made Anthony Eden insane. I mean, almost literally. And so, there's some issues there. But
I think both Napoleon and Churchill, it's hard for anyone. I mean, look at pro athletes. How do you know when to step down and say, all right, well, that's a career?
Yeah. I mean, it's, the person I know who was the most successful at this is Jerry Seinfeld. He hit the top of his game and he was like, I'm done. Seinfeld's over. We had a great run. He got out, and now we have 9 years of great TV show and no bad years. There's also an interesting thing here where Alan Paquin, and I like this, there was the story about Gladstone being a young man in a hurry. Initially, this is a 19th century thing. And then Churchill was a young man in a hurry. And I think it's very clear to see that Napoleon was a young man in a hurry. You make that argument kind of about Hitler, maybe not exactly. Hitler obviously dies, but both Churchill and I think Napoleon at the end are also old men in a hurry. Churchill's he realizes that the clock's counting down and he's doing everything he can in 51, 55 to help sort of solve the Cold War problem because he thought when Stalin died, that would be a moment for everybody to come back together. Whereas, Napoleon has his 100 days and then it's like you're on saying there's nothing you can do but write your book. You're out of pocket.
Yeah.
And so, he has to furiously get his account down.
Yeah. That's a great point. They were, all of them. I mean, Napoleon, look at all he did by the time he was 30. He was in a hurry, for sure.
Yeah. And this all goes back to them, I guess, being men of action, for good or for ill,
Yeah. All good stuff. Well, Warren, that was a perfect summary and just what I was looking for on the comparison of all three men. Thank you for that. Again, if you want to find Warren, you can track him down on X/Twitter, Warren Dockter, Dockter. And again, I recommend any of his books on Amazon. They'd be a good read for you. And we thank you again for coming on, Warren.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you were great. My pleasure.